Welcome to the 34th episode of the Soon Recap podcast. Today, Benjamin and I will be covering a few international events that aren't portrayed so prominently throughout the world, but are still of high importance in terms of geopolitics. So to start off with, obviously there was a major breakout of conflict between India and Pakistan over the weekend, and though there has been a U.S.-mediated ceasefire, there's still a lot of tensions at play. Obviously, Pakistan has some terrorist groups, but Benjamin will explain more.
Okay, so actually it didn't start this weekend. It started on April 22nd, approximately, 3 weeks ago?
Mm-hmm.
During the Kashmir terror attack by the Lashkar terror group, which is based in Pakistan. However, Pakistan does not recognize this group as terrorists. Okay? And then on May 7th, India carried out retaliatory strikes on Pakistan, claiming to target this terrorist group.
Mm-hmm.
Pakistan then claimed that they downed between 1 and 5 Indian jets.
Oh, wow.
So, even though they had a ceasefire on May 10th, both sides claimed they won the conflict because India had successful strikes inside of Pakistan, and Pakistan downed 1 to 5 Indian fighter jets.
Mm-hmm. So, are either sides acknowledging, the other side's win? So, for example, is India acknowledging that it had its fighter jets downed?
No, so India is claiming that Pakistan did not down any jets and that all of their strikes were successful, while Pakistan is claiming that India struck civilian targets because they don't recognize the terror group as terrorists.
Okay. So there is a conflict of interest for Pakistan right there regarding the terrorist group because they can say they're civilians even if they are potentially criminals. So it's kind of disinformation on their part, right?
Actually, this entire conflict has been riddled with disinformation, as old strikes from around the area have been coming out and people are trying to portray them as current pictures and images.
Mm-hmm. And additionally, it must be noted that, especially previously in the War on Terror that the U.S. fought, many terror groups were training in Pakistan, not actually in Afghanistan, since obviously Afghanistan, the terrain is very, very difficult, while Pakistan can obviously house more people. It has an environment that is more similar to where terrorists may conduct attacks, and it also just has more money since it is a more prosperous nation. Afghanistan, even nowadays, is very, very poor. They do rely on many illicit industries such as opium in order to sustain the country's GDP. And Pakistan and India have been essentially an eternal conflict since the creation of those two states in 1947 with the partition plan, and it really did not split those two nations effectively. There are many Hindu towns still within Pakistan, and there's thousands and millions of Muslims still within India, and the migration crisis created by that has really created a lot of disparities between the nations and their leaders, since they view the other side as not taking care of their own people, even if they're not in their respective nations.
Yeah, so also before the ceasefire, there was a fear that because both India and Pakistan are nuclear nations, that it would potentially spark World War III.
Mm-hmm. I'd never heard that thought before because, yes, we do acknowledge that they are nuclear powers, but it never came to my head, for example, that they would go to that step because at first it was just strikes. I know it's pretty militaristic at that point, but it's not so close to nuclear weaponry.
Well, the thing is, if Pakistan had retaliated on India for India's retaliation on the terror attack, it would have sparked an actual war instead of just being a back and forth and then ceasefire.
Yeah, okay.
Something else of note was everyone around the world was just standing by waiting to see what would happen, including the US, China, Russia, UK, France, and other powers. No one did anything other than arbitrate a ceasefire.
Yeah, so do you think an intervention could have been caused earlier or not?
I don't know, it was just weird that no one took any sides in the conflict.
Yeah, it's hard to, maintain neutrality, especially in this world, but I think that, especially with every like tension point going on. I think some countries didn't want to dip their hands in other potential conflicts. But towards the future, do you think that there's going to be another breakout of conflict in the Kashmir region or not?
I think that India and Pakistan have been don't they have a zone where there's no weapons allowed because since they're both nuclear powers, they don't want stuff to get out of hand. So
Yeah, there
fight
are
each other with bats and stuff.
there are a few provinces in which weapons are severely limited. Okay, so moving on, there has been a problem in Sudan in which the government military, the Sudan Armed Forces, and the RSF, or the Rapid Support Forces, have been creating a civil war within the country. This occurs after a 29 overthrowing of a dictatorial government in Sudan, and additionally the overthrow of a transitional government in 2021. Both were successful coups, but now the RSF and the SAF, which came together during those conflicts to combat the government, now are fighting each other and have caused mass refugee problems. And actually there's a severe malnourishment problem, obviously, as they are in the Sahel region of the world. If you don't know what that is basically sub-Saharan Africa, where food resources are still limited due to the desert climate. And the UN predicts that over 250,000 children could die of malnourishment if there's no intervention in this conflict. Would you like to say more, Benjamin?
Okay. So the RSF is actually used to be a part of the SAF.
Mm-hmm.
And the leader of the RSF used to be the deputy of the general in charge of the Sudan Armed Forces.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, conflict between these two groups started in 2023 after a disagreement between the two generals about whether or not the RSF would be integrated into the SAF.
So essentially it's like if a really big let's say if special ops from the army split and then the US Army was fighting it.
Pretty much. Well, yeah.
Okay, even if it's not that high tech, there are a lot of casualties. Obviously, both sides possess military weaponry such as mortars and shelling. Therefore, a lot of civilian areas have been harmed since both sides are targeting buildings if they think that the other side is there, even if it's literally just civilians. And additionally, there has been evidence of torturing if soldiers from either side see that you have, for example, a picture of a soldier from the SAF in your home, then they might interrogate you and torture you. And this has been outcried because that is pretty much disregarding the rules of war, and especially there's a disregard for a few UN Sustainable Development Goals, as there's not a mandatory giving of aid from the army to the people in terms of medical or food or water aid, and the people are just sitting ducks and they're starving and dying. And in Khartoum, which is one of the largest cities in Africa, actually, which is the capital of Sudan, there has been a record number of casualties in the entire continent. There has been a record number of shelling in the entire continent. And actually, a few days ago in Port Sudan, rebels used drones to attack the port, therefore hindering the government's ability to ship goods into the nation. Do you have anything to say about that?
So the conflict has spiraled into the world's largest humanitarian crisis, and regional powers and global powers have been taking sides supporting both. So the UAE and others have been supporting the RSF because of resources in the region that they want. The UAE doesn't have arable land, and there's arable land in Sudan, so they want that. And also the Red Sea connections.
What also many people don't realize is that Sudan is an Arabic-speaking country, and they do have many connections to the Arabic world. So Saudi Arabia, the UAE, would have a foot in that domain since they are speaking intelligible languages. And also the culture plays a lot into this conflict because, for example, if the Russians were to intervene with the Wagner Group, as they have been doing, that could be seen as a colonial power in interfering whereas the UAE is not such an interfering power.
Actually, you brought up Russia, but Russia is taking sides in the conflict as well.
Yeah, I mentioned that they are putting Wagner soldiers there, which essentially is part of the Russian military at this point.
Yeah. Russia uses Wagner when they want, like, plausible deniability about their intervention in conflicts.
Now, like, what are the circumstances in which a nation can, like, contract militias and armed groups such as Wagner to, like, fight in their wars? Like, are there any preconditions?
There aren't really, and everyone uses militant groups and everyone uses mercenaries. The only thing is mercenaries are not considered parts of the armed forces and therefore are not subject to stuff like the Geneva Convention or they don't have to be taken as prisoners of war because they're technically armed combatants, but they're not.
They can just be killed.
Armed forces.
Yeah.
So they don't have to be taken as prisoners of war, and even when they are, they don't have to be treated humanely.
So, with the Red Sea, moving on, there's a lot of trading in the Red Sea. But on the other side of the world, there's a different sort of trade, and that is the trade of drugs. In Europe, there has been a surge in cocaine and meth seizings at ports due to narco subs and other forms of shipping drugs towards Europe becoming very prevalent. More on these narco subs, so many people don't know about this, but in the Amazon basin and in the entire Amazon region, there are docks where people build quote-unquote narco subs. These are illegal submarines in which you can put a lot of cocaine and other drugs in the hold, and you have 2 or 3 crew members piloting it across the Atlantic or on the other side across the Pacific to Australia.
Okay, so a little bit of fact checking. They're semi-submersible, not fully submersible, so there's still a little bit of the top sticking out of the water. Also, you can fit like multiple tons of illicit substances inside of a narco sub, and they're a lot more efficient than, say, like a boat on the surface because
you can see a boat.
Yeah, they blend in a lot better, and you can fit a lot more in the narco sub because almost the entire submarine is dedicated to storing those drugs.
And with the camouflage that they use, obviously they are very low to the water. There's only about a quarter of the ship above the water. And they have paints depending on which ocean, which is almost like what a military would do, because obviously battleships, they have camouflage depending on the ocean, correct?
Battleships and other warships tend to use gray because they're on the surface, so they would blend in with the haze on the horizon so that they're harder to see. Versus narco subs, because the main way you would spot them is via helicopter. They actually blend into the water instead of the horizon.
Oh, okay, yeah. And then the only tool that has actually been proven to find these narco subs is thermal imagery, since you cannot easily spot them and they're not necessarily so visible on radar. I mean, the technology in them is very confusing. In one model that the Spanish armed forces seized, in the driving cockpit, there were many wires sticking out, and it was just a bunch of different computers stuck together to make one driving module.
So narco subs tend to be like one-time use. We build it to transport X amount of goods to a certain place, and then it's disposed of afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, they're semi-submersible, but they're also, like, not very structurally strong. They are, like, I think it's some plywood that's, like, made for the sea and also some metal sheets, but it is not, like, super sturdy. And within the cockpit, actually, there's a bunch of pipes that obstruct, like, where you can sit, and there's also fumes coming from the engine. Therefore, it could become dangerous if you made multiple voyages.
Yeah, but narco subs tend to be single use, and they just kind of DIY throw it together every time they want to make a trip. Which is why it's so, like, there's so many problems with the cockpits and stuff. But did you know that the U.S. has theorized using something similar to narco subs for logistics if they ever end up in a conflict with China in the Pacific? Because of how small they can be and how versatile they are,
yes,
along with their low profile.
I mean, that would work, but at the amount of cargo that the U.S. needs, that would be like thousands of ships needed.
Well, the thing is, in an island hopping campaign, it'd be a few thousand Marines on an island, not an entire battalion.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I guess that does make sense, yeah. And lastly, I would like to talk about the PKK disbanding and stopping their fight against Turkey. Go.
Okay, so the PKK's leader has been imprisoned in Turkey since 1999 and has recently called for a cessation of conflict between the PKK and the Turkish armed forces. And the theory is that he will receive he will be paroled because of his calling for the cessation of conflict.
Now, I actually read through an article, and some of the terms were actually kind of vague. So it said that the PKK will cease operations such as fighting Turkey under the name PKK. So either that means they will disband the PKK, or they're just going to rename themselves and start a different group. But I don't think the second option is likely because, obviously, as you said, the leader has been in prison in Turkey and obviously has had interrogations, most likely. Therefore, he wouldn't try to make his loyal subjects do more things that could get him in trouble since he has already been released from prison.
Has he been released?
Oh, well, since he will be released.
Okay.
That's what we mean.
Okay. The leader also said that he wants to move towards a democratic process to pursue a independent Kurdish state because he realized that conflict is not going to result in any actual movement towards his cause.
Now, do you think that they will try to come together with Kurdish groups in Syria, for example, to form a proto-Kurdish state, or will it still require a lot of international intervention?
They'll probably come together, but it will require international assistance in establishing a Kurdish state.
Mm-hmm. What I believe is that what's going to happen, much like some of the republics in Russia, is that they're going to reach a semi-autonomous status in which they do have some governmental freedom and have more culturally specific tribal laws, but it's not going to be a full-on independent country since they probably don't have all the economy and resources to sustain themselves. With Chechnya, for example, in Russia, it was once like a very rebel province to like the Russian Republic, but now they're just an independent republic in the south, and they don't really mess with the Russian government as much anymore. Well, thank you for listening to the 37th episode of the Student Recap Podcast, and we hope you enjoyed this international Blindspot coverage.